Welcome to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, you're welcome here. This is our 15th lecture in the Biblical Scholarship and Literacy series, and today we're going to talk about the book of Exodus. I want to remind everyone, of course, that we have this webpage. The webpage has links to all the lectures and to the extra materials and handouts, anything like that that I use, you can get to from the webpage, as well as all the additional reading I recommend, the recommended books that I have. If you remember last time I had some, I said I recommended the New Revised Standard Version for reading, and I recommended the Oxford Annotated Study Bible because of the commentary it had. I said, for example, it had a great 2 pages on the historicity of the Exodus that is very useful and fun and good. I also said that this William H.C. Prop wrote a really great commentary on Exodus that I recommend from the Anchor Bible Dictionary. Unfortunately, these things are about $50 a piece, and there's 2 of them, so that's like $100. But you might be able to get it from the library, and if the library doesn't have it, you can tell the library to buy it, and that would make me happy anyway. So, they really ought to have this for me, and that would make my life easier and make me have to pay less if a lot of people came and said, buy the Anchor Bible for the... Anyway, this book is the Ancient Near East text related to the Old Testament by Pritchard. This is really good if you really want to get into source material. So when I start talking about the laws and things and I compare them to the laws of the Ancient Near East, this is probably where I'm pulling those law codes from the Ancient Near East, or the story of different kings from the Ancient Near East that relate to the biblical text. I'm getting it from here, which is really useful. Unfortunately, my notes are in the Annotated Study Bible, and my eyes stink, so I have an RSV big print thing, and I'll be reading from the big print because I can actually see it. But that means that my notes are in a different book than the book I'm reading from, so you apologize if I have to swip back and forth or something in the middle. Last time we finished Genesis and we summarized everything that was in there, and we've been at this for a good year, and we're finally done with Genesis, and we talked about everything from a bird's eye view, and we summarized everything we had done, and we introduced the story of the Exodus. So as part of our summary of Genesis, we talked about the blessing at the very end. That was the last story we hadn't talked about. One thing I should have added is that there's a series of texts in the Old Testament that most scholars, not all, think are really old. This is one of them. It seems to be, one of the later sources is quoting it, but he seems to have access to an old poem. It's written in poetry, and the Hebrew in it is archaic. And so it, possibly some later author is faking. We could do that. You can tell somebody to write a story in Shakespearean English, or you can tell somebody to write a story in Jane Austen style, and we could try to do that. Whether we would succeed or not is another story. And what we have here is a text that seems to be written in archaic Hebrew. Later person faking it, or an actual old text. So this is one of those texts that seems to be really old. I should have mentioned that. And it's Jacob who gives these blessings to each of his 12 children. We covered that last time. And then we gave this overview of the whole book, what's in it, and we talked about the different structure of the different cycles and all that stuff, and we concluded with some of the themes. So if you're interested in that, that's in the last lecture. I just barely finished uploading that one. It's online right now, so you can go listen to the last lecture if you want. We also talked about the Exodus, and to introduce it, we just told the story in very brief, right? They were slaves in Egypt. They left, and they went to Mount Sinai. Then they wandered for 40 years, went to the Promised Land, and passed through the Jordan River into the Promised Land. And we talked about how people like Paul and later Christian authors have turned this into an allegory for our lives on the earth, for Christ's atonement, for all that sort of thing, for baptism. They'll see baptism in the Red Sea, that sort of thing. So we're interested both in the text and what the original authors thought the text meant, but we're also interested in how later interpreters thought of the text and what they thought it meant. And so, for example, we have that Christian allegory. So the entire biblical narrative starts in Babylon. Right? We have a preamble, which is the pre-world history, the creation and the Tower of Babel. And then we have Abraham, who starts in Babylon. And then he's called, and he goes to the Promised Land, and he's forged in Egypt. And then we have the Exodus story. They come out of the Exodus, they conquer the land, and they form their own kingdom. We have the story of the kings. And then they're conquered by the Babylonians and sent back into Babylonian captivity. So you notice we end where we begin. That's kind of the biblical cycle of stories. And then later on, some texts were tacked on. And this is kind of the what happened after texts. But they were kind of tacked on later. And so the Bible has this neat beginning and end that ties it up, beginning in Babylon, ending in Babylon. But it also has a middle point, kind of a crux around which the whole thing turns. And that crux is the Exodus story. So it's an incredibly important story to the narrative we're going to tell. People ask a lot of common questions, like who wrote this? Well, the traditional story was Moses wrote it. But we've already discussed the documentary hypothesis. I think it was like the second lecture we gave, or the third, was on the documentary hypothesis. You're welcome to go back and listen to that again, where it posited at least 4 main sources, J, E, P, and D, which is the letters we give them, that have been combined into this larger text. Now, people will tell you today that the documentary hypothesis no longer has a consensus of scholars' opinions about it. However, the main thesis of the documentary hypothesis is still most widely accepted. What's happened is people have expanded on it, and they've created versions of it, and they've created one where maybe one of the sources isn't there, or another one where there's 4 other sources, and tried to split it out further. And there's other versions where they had this source, but one of the sources just expanded on earlier sources. And so there's variations on a theme. But the core concept that Moses didn't write this, that it was compiled at a later date from multiple earlier possible sources, is widely accepted. And so that's the approach I'm going to use in this class. I'm just going to assume the documentary hypothesis, and we'll talk about texts from J, E, P, etc., and we'll just kind of make that assumption. But that's the background. There's also a lot of interesting information on historicity. Did this happen? I'm not going to cover that now. We want to get through the main text. Once we get people through the Red Sea and into Mount Sinai, I'm going to have a break, and we'll go back and talk about historicity questions. In other words, did this happen? If it didn't happen, how do we know it didn't happen? If it did happen, why do we think it did? Which pieces of it maybe happened and which pieces of it maybe are myth? I told you before my bias is for mythicized history, meaning I think that these stories have kernels of things that happened that got expanded on and added to and turned into myth-making stories. And by myth, I just mean meaning-making stories. An example of mythicized history in the United States is the story of George Washington. I did not tell a lie. I chopped down the cherry tree. That story probably never happened, but George Washington was a real person. And what we have in that story is a way we think about ourselves as an honest people. What does it mean to be an American is caught up in that story and what it means. And so if we have some real event, a core event, then you can mythicize it and tell a story that creates meaning for you as religious meaning or a cultural meaning or a national meaning from the story and from the way you choose to tell the story. So that's my bias. Because we're not going to cover the historicity till the end, or till at least we get through Sinai, through the Red Sea, I need to do that because to talk about historicity, we need to know what the story says. But on the other hand, as we read the story, the hints that will later be used are going to be dropped. And so I'll kind of point at them and say, this is an interesting point. We'll come back to it. So as I go through it, you'll see me do that a lot. And then we can talk about the meaning, the theology, the law codes. This is what rabbis spend all their lives studying, is how do we interpret these laws? What do they mean for how we should live today? That's an entire thing we could spend our lives doing. And so I'm going to try to balance some of this and go through some of this, but not get too caught in any one piece that we spend forever. Like I said, I could spend the rest of my life talking about the laws, and rabbis do. And so we're not going to do that. We just want to point out that that's an interesting way of approaching the text and questions we might ask about it. So let's talk about the story. And we told it in brief, but let's dive into it in a little bit deeper structure. Now, to do that, we need to back up and kind of look at the structure of the text. Chapters 1 through 15 is the departure. Chapters 15 through 40 is what happens on Sinai. So most of the book takes place on Sinai. The departure is kind of a preamble to get you to Sinai. And then all of the book of Leviticus happens on Sinai. And then Deuteronomy presumably happens right before they go into the promised land, where he repeats the laws given on Sinai. So Sinai is the core of this whole book, and it's the core of the next couple books that are going to come after it. So Sinai is what it's about. 1 through 15 gets us there. So let's go into 1 through 15. Now to do that, we can kind of break that up into pieces. Chapter 1, the Israelites are enslaved. Chapter 2, Moses is born and saved. Chapter 2, 11 through 22, he flees to Midian. Chapter 3 through 4, Moses is called and we have a burning bush. And then it goes, he returns to Egypt and it keeps going. We're not going to make it that far. I'm going to start at the beginning and hopefully make it into chapter 3 somewhere. So we'll see how far we make it, but that's what we're going to do. Israel enslaved, birth of Moses, Moses flees, and then the beginning of the burning bush. That's hopefully what we'll do today. And maybe we won't. We'll see how far we get. So let's turn in. Feel free to read along if you want. In the library over here, there's some NRSVs that you can read. That's the version I'm reading from. So if you wanted to follow along, you can grab some from the library. Otherwise, you can just listen. That's fine. So it says, these are the names. Now, this is verse 1. I point that out because in Hebrew, you name a book by the first kind of word of the book. And so Exodus is the book of the names. Even though that doesn't really have any the main thematic element of the text. I should add that the Exodus is a term that comes kind of through the Greek and the Latin, as I understand it, and it means to leave, obviously. And so that's the name we get in English. But these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. And then we start listing the 12 tribes. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar. Now I should point out that we begin with the assumption that all 12 tribes are in Israel. In fact, that's what we saw in the book of Genesis. However, the rest of the text almost exclusively only mentions Levites in the story. Moses is a Levite. And this is an important kind of hint for maybe what happened in the historicity. Historicity is a fancy scholar word for did it happen, what happened in history versus what happens in narrative. So again, we're telling the story in the narrative form it has, but we'll point out little hints when they show up. This is kind of the first. So we begin with this assumption that they're all there, but in verse 7 it says, but the Israelites were fruitful and prolific, and they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Fruitful is a reference back to Genesis. So we'll have many, what we'll call intertextualities, references back to earlier texts, things we've already studied. So if you want to go back and go through Genesis again, it's important because the Genesis material is assumed by the authors and they will point back at it. Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth is a command given by God in Genesis. And so here we have the first of many callbacks to the creation. The Exodus story is the story of the creation of Israel as a nation, and it will mention and refer itself to Genesis as the story of creation. And so here we have Israel doing what God commanded the people to do in Genesis. And this is what gets them in trouble. And this sets up a conflict, not between Israel and the Egyptians, but between God and the Egyptians, because it's God's command to multiply and replenish the earth that gets them in trouble. Well, how does it get them in trouble? So verse 8, now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. This is the first kind of thing we can look at and go, I don't think so. Right? That doesn't make any sense. The Israelites were never, ever more numerous and more powerful than the Egyptians. But the author is telling the story this way. It's how many there are that gets them in trouble. I should also point out, it's how many there are that makes the Exodus historically dubious. Because there's a famous saying, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, is the common term. And the problem with that phrase is that, for those of you who are really nerdy, in Bayesian theory, absence of evidence is evidence of absence. In other words, if you expect some evidence to be there, if something is true, that evidence should be there, and it's not, that thing becomes not impossible, but less likely. An exodus of this many people, which, if you take the numbers in the text, literally ends up being about 2 million people. It lists the number of men, and then you can assume how many women and children, you end up with about 2 million people. You can just do the math. 2 million people, if they left Sinai marching about 8 abreast, left Egypt marching 8 abreast, most of them would still be in Egypt when the rest of them made it to Mount Sinai. It does not make sense. The numbers are too big. But remember, the size of the numbers is what sets up the conflict, according to this author. So let's see. He said, look, the people are more numerous than me. So verse 10, come, let us deal shrewdly with them. This come, let us phraseology is also something we see in the Tower of Babel story. Come, let us make a tower whose top may reach to heaven. This is men trying to thwart the will of God. And then God responds, come, let us go down and see what the children of men are doing. And then God thwarts them. This sets up, again, man trying to do something, Pharaoh trying to stop the Israelites, and God will come down and make sure that doesn't happen, and that's our plague story in the Exodus. So this sets up, this conflict between God and Egypt, not between Egypt and Israel necessarily. So the first thing he tries to do is he makes slaves of them. So the Pharaoh will have several attempts to curtail the numbers of the Israelites. And the first is he makes slaves of them. This parallels Jacob's story. Do you remember Jacob goes to Lot, and Lot makes him serve him for so many years? Servitude and slavery are the same thing in the ancient Near East. We think of slavery in terms of black slavery in America. Slavery in the ancient Near East was different. Slavery was usually indentured servitude. You were in debt, and you paid your debts by, if you couldn't pay them, then you had to work for the person you owed money to until you paid it off. And that's where slavery came from. Or you could capture somebody in war and make a slave of them. So it was either a war capture or it was indentured servitude. You can almost think of Jacob as Laban's slave. In that sense, he was an indentured servant working for 7 years to pay back his debt for the wives he married there. And you remember, he starts, all the cattle prosper, and he ends up with all the cattle. And Laban's like, you're supposed to be working for me to make money, and you're getting all the cattle. So every arrangement they make to give certain cattle to him and certain cattle to his father-in-law ends up going the other way around, and Jacob gets all the cattle. Everything he does to try to curtail Jacob's success turns back on himself and fails. And so here we have, again, this is a callback to Genesis. He says, let's deal shrewdly, let's make them slaves. But it says in verse 12, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. That is almost word for what it says about happened to Jacob. Now, the more he tried to take his cattle, the more Jacob's cattle increased. And so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. Again, not likely, but nevertheless, here we go. Verse 14, and they made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick. Certain words in this text are important, and they will play both a ritual and a kind of thematic role. The first is the cry, and the next is God heard. The people cry, God hears. We'll look for that phrase because it will be repeated over and over. But the most interesting to me is service. The Hebrew word for service and the Hebrew word for slave are the same. And so is the word for temple service. Service at the tabernacle. And so is the phrase in Genesis when Adam and Eve are told to dress and keep the garden in the King James. That word is the same root, service. They're to work in the garden to take care of it. But then they eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge and good and evil. They're cast out, and now they have to work by the sweat of their brow for their bread. And so there is a theme going on here with work. The Egyptians have made slaves of the Israelites and caused them to work in bitter work. Bitter will become important when you eat bitter herbs in the Passover. Bitter work for the Egyptians. This is again like, by the sweat of your brow you shall work to eat the sweat of your brow. But then God comes down and says, I'm going to save these people and take them to work for me at the tabernacle, at the temple. I'm going to replace their service to the Egyptians with service to God in the temple service. We still use that phrase today. After this class, we will go into the service. And so we're going to replace service to the Egyptians with service to God. Ritual temple service, specifically. We'll see how that plays out. Verse 15, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives. Now, the slavery isn't working, so we got to try something else. One of whom was named Sipporah and the other Puah. Now, this is Sifra. Dang it. Sifra. One is named Sifra and the other Puah. It's important to get those names right. It's interesting that Pharaoh's name is never mentioned in the text. Several pharaohs come and go through this text, and they never get a name. But these two random midwives get a name. And I don't think that the author here is trying to elevate women in the abstract, right? That women's role is better than we think. I think what he's doing is he lives in a culture where women are denigrated. And he therefore takes women and uses them as foils against Pharaoh. And he says, these lowly slave women outwit Pharaoh. He's trying to make Pharaoh look like an idiot. Not because I really think that women, are not capable of beating up on and outwitting a man, but because in the ancient world that was probably thought. And so by using women to outwit these powerful men, the author is showing the man as a fool. Now, the other important point is that Israel was an underdog. All of their national history, they were the small nation, they were the ones surrounded by these great powers, and they often identified with the underdog. And so by taking these women, these underdogs, and showing them prospering against the mighty through the help of God, Israel felt like they could prosper against the mighty through the help of God, and they would identify themselves with these lowly characters. That actually has an important, from a gender perspective, gender science, that has an important impact, because when you identify yourself with the lowly, you have the effect of elevating the lowly whether you mean to or not. And so the place of women actually becomes elevated almost on accident through this sort of association of the women as the lowly, etc. Did you have a question?
One other thing about the reason why the pharaohs wouldn't be named, wouldn't a part of it also be because at the time, you're saying that this is a very old story, at that time the pharaohs were worshipped as gods, both while they were alive and after their deaths by a lot of people. So if you name one of these people, that's naming a god that's very important to your nearest neighbor. Would that impact the story?
Probably.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, one of the ways in Egypt people would respond to somebody they don't like, who's done bad things, is they'll erase their name from everywhere and refuse to mention their names, because their name was their symbol. The symbol was the reality of the person according to Egyptian magic rule. And by remembering the name, you remember the person, and that's one of the things that grants eternal life to these people. And so by erasing the name, you see. So that's possibly another reason. Another reason is they may not have remembered by now, but they remember the names of these midwives, and they don't remember the names of Pharaoh. So by the time this is written, they may not even remember his name. But there's a reason they don't remember his name. He doesn't matter, and these lowly midwives do. And this is, again, important for the story. So the midwives said to... Pharaoh says to the midwives, when you act as midwives, if a boy is born, kill it. If a woman is born, leave it alive. Why the men? Well, because if you live in a patriarchal society, then women are kind of property. And if you kill off the men, then the women go to the Egyptians, and the children then become Egyptians, and you've committed genocide. This is a genocide of the culture of the Israelites in Egypt by killing the men and taking the women. The midwives refused to do it. It says they feared God. And so in verse 19, Pharaoh says, why didn't you do it? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are so vigorous and give birth before the midwives even come to them. This is a lie. But the midwives are lying to Pharaoh. And, we often get the question, why is it okay to lie like this in the biblical text? I mean, one of the 10 Commandments later on will be, do not bear false witness. And here we have these midwives bearing false witness to Pharaoh. And I want to kind of point out, and Pete Enns did this before me, that's a very white privilege question to ask. When you're in a position of servitude to someone who's committing genocide, it's probably okay to lie, especially when you have to do so to survive. This points out the contextual nature of Hebrew law, something that the Jews have recognized for a long, long time, and that maybe fundamentalist Christians would do well to recognize, and that is that the laws are contextual. When you live in the land of Israel, and there are judges there set up by God who are told to judge righteously, you should not lie in court. You should not bear false witness. References lying in court. Don't give false witness to a trial in court. When there's a righteous court there to give to, when you're a slave to Pharaoh who has unjustly put you in slavery, these people were not owing money. They weren't conquered in war. There is no Near Eastern justification for their slavery. And yet, they were made slaves anyway. This is an unjust situation, and they lie through their teeth to Pharaoh. We'll see lies come up several times here. And apparently that's not only okay, it's a good thing, and these people are remembered for what they did. So laws have contextual nature. The right thing to do in one situation is not always the right thing to do in another situation. Did you?
For me, another big part of this whole thing is, this goes all the way into the New Testament, but in the New Testament, Jesus violates one of the 10 Commandments deliberately. by picking fruit on the Sabbath. And that's something that a lot of people also seem to forget about. But it's a pretty important part of Christianity because, I guess it's kind of like the opposite of what YHWH would say. When he would say that if an axe murderer has come and asked you, he wants to know where your friend is, and he's going to kill your friend, Kant says that you should tell him the truth.
No, you should lie, right? Kant's wrong.
I mean, that's clearly nonsense.
A legalistic interpretation of rules gets everybody into trouble when you don't recognize the context of the situation, and this is what Jesus is trying to do with the picking fruit on the Sabbath as well. Now, we can argue about whether he actually broke the Ten Commandments. I think Jesus' argument is that's not actually against the Ten Commandments when they're properly interpreted, because context is part of the law itself. But I think this is the example. The law is this book. That the law refers to the first 5 books of Moses, and the law indicates the contextual nature of all of these commandments. And again, that's a fairly well understood principle that fundamentalists of all religious stripes would do well to kind of take into account. All right, so they lie. So Pharaoh comes up with a third option. Let's do something different. If these midwives aren't going to work, let's do this. So I took this picture from Prince of Egypt, which, by the way, we still need to have a movie night and watch. And so he says, verse 22, Pharaoh commanded his people, every boy that is born of the Hebrews, you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live. The midwives weren't doing it, so he's commanding all the people to murder every Hebrew boy. This ends chapter 1. So chapter 1 ends on this horrific note of mass genocide and murder on the part of the Egyptians. And it is very important to put that in context, because the plagues that follow, all the things God does to the Egyptians from this point on, are in this context. They are retribution for this act. And in the text, the author seems to feel that justice is important and that what goes around comes around. And if you try to commit genocide against my people, you will be treated in a similar way yourself. Because remember, the plagues, which we won't get to, but when we get to the plagues, end with the death of the firstborn children of the Egyptians. And that narrative begins with the murder of the Israelite children for doing nothing more than having lots of kids. And so they're going to kill him. So again, the justice of the story is missed if you skip that part of the story. It's an incredibly important part of the narrative. So chapter 2, that all sets up Moses. So in chapter 2, we're going to introduce Moses onto the scene. There is a problem. Chapter 1 set up the problem. Chapter 2 begins the solution. And so it says, now a man from the house of Levi, it doesn't tell us the name, went and married a Levite woman, and the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine baby, she loved her baby. That's what happens after you give birth, right? She loved her baby, so she hid him for 3 months. But you can imagine how hard that would be. So it says, when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him. Now, I also should have pointed out, do you remember in the New Testament, Herod kills all the babies to make sure that Christ isn't born because there was a prophet? We don't have any historical record of that happening, but it's the author of that story is borrowing from this story. They're pointing back to this event, right? Herod tries to kill all the babies, and Jesus is saved by going to Egypt, of all places. And so now we have this other story where Moses is saved. But this time he's saved. She put him in a papyrus basket and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. This term for the basket is the same term used for the ark, Noah's ark. So again, we're having a reference to Noah's ark. And the references are more explicit because she covers it with pitch and bitumen. And again, those are terms used to describe how Noah sealed the ark so it would be watertight and float. Those references are also important ritualistically because they reference atonement, to cover, kafar. It with this pitch is a word that comes from the same root as the covering. Those terms are used for the Ark of the Covenant and for the atonement act of covering the sins of Israel made at the ark. So Noah's ark saved the people. The atonement and rituals at the temple saved the people from their sins by covering their sins with pitch. So this phrase covering has this ritual implication. So the myth and the rituals that they will perform point at each other. And here we've repeated the story with Moses. The point, I think, that the author here is making is that the Noah's Ark story is a recreation of the world. Here we are, by pointing at that story, you can see that God is doing something like what he did in Noah's Ark. He's taking a new baby, Moses, and through this baby he's going to recreate, not the world, but in this case he's going to create the nation of Israel, forged in Egypt. So there's a reference to this creation, and now a reference to the recreation of the flood by the boat that they make for Moses. So they plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds at the bank of the river, and his sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him.
What is bitumen?
It's a oily pitch sort of thing and I don't actually know where this particular type of it comes from, and I don't even know if we know but it's some sort of an oil tar pitch that you would put on wood or on a reed basket to make it float. So let's see. I guess let's see what order that's this. Okay, so the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the river, and while her attendants walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maids to bring it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and he was crying, and she took pity on him. This must be one of the Hebrews' children, she said. She knows this is a Hebrew child. She knows she's supposed to kill it. Pharaoh commanded her to kill it. And what do we have? A woman, and what's she doing? She's circumventing Pharaoh and making a fool of him. But she's an Egyptian woman, not just a Hebrew woman. Right? So she says, and then the sister, remember his sister was hiding in the reeds, and the sister says to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? In other words, you need somebody, if you're going to keep this child, you need someone to give suck to it, presumably because she's not producing milk at the moment, right? And the Pharaoh's daughter said to him, yes. So the girl went and called who? The child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to the mother of the child, take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages. She's going to pay her, a slave, to nurse this child for her. And so 3 women, the mother, his sister, and the Pharaoh's princess, save Moses and again outwit the king. So the woman took the child and nursed her own child, right? And when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. And she took him as her son. So she's adopted this person as her child. And she named him Moses because, she said, I drew him out of the water. Now the author here of our text gives this Egyptian princess a flair for Hebrew. She named him Moses because I drew. In fact, this almost would translate. If you were to translate Moses' name as Drew, we have names named Drew. I named him Drew because I drew him out of the water. That's what's happening here. In Hebrew, the term Moses and to draw out are the same, or at least similar from the same roots. So she claims that's the name. That is not actually what Moses' name means. This is what we call a folk etymology. In other words, later on, people would look back in time and see a word and make up what they think it meant and put that in the story, because that's what it meant to them at a later date. But we actually know what Moses' name really means because it's an Egyptian name. Now, I can't imagine that the Pharaoh's daughter speaks Hebrew. You don't learn the language of your slaves. The slaves learn your language. Right? She can't speak Hebrew. She doesn't know what the name Moses means, or what to draw out in Hebrew means, but she knows the Egyptian names for people. And here we have Ramses. Let me point out the point. This is Ra, and this is MSS. Ramesses means the son of Ra. Here we have Tut, Moses. The tooth is Toth, the son of Toth. King Tutmosis is the son of Toth. King Ramses is the son of Ra. And Moses is the son of nobody. Moses is the whole thing is just the son. And the Ra and the Tut and all that stuff is missing. Now, whether she named him with the name of an Egyptian god, Moses, that's possible, and the Israelites cut the Egyptian god out of his name. But it's even more possible that because she doesn't know whose child this is, because she drew him out of the water, you see the double pun here, she named him Moses, the son of nobody, because she doesn't know where he came from. But he's now his adopted son. Well, this is interesting because we don't know who the Pharaoh of the Exodus is, but it's often coined as Ramses the second or so. So Ramses, the son of Ra, pitted against Moses, the son of nobody. or possibly the Son of God, or something like this, the son of Yahweh. And so we'll pit these gods against each other by pitting their representative, Moses and Ramesses, against each other. Either way, we have several puns on his name. One is to draw out of the water, but the other is possibly a pun that the author of the text didn't even know, and that's the son of nobody, which is the Egyptian meaning of his name. Okay, so the child grew, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, he became her son, she called his name son of nobody, because I drew him out of the water, which also has that Hebrew pun. Now, let's talk for just a second about Sargon the Great. This is a picture of the head of Sargon the Great, and I promise this is going to be relevant in just a minute. Sargon the Great was one of the first great kings of the ancient Near East. He conquered the world, the known world at the time. The first creator, maybe, of empire is a way to think about him. And there's a story about Sargon the Great. It's available in Pritchard, the book I mentioned earlier, but I'm going to read it to you because it's relevant. My mother was a high priestess. My father, I knew not. The brothers of my father loved the hills, and my city is Azupiranu, which is situated in the banks of the Euphrates. My high priestess mother conceived me, but in secret she bore me. He doesn't tell you why in secret. There's got to be some great backstory that we're missing. But she bore him in secret, and she set me in a basket of rushes. Does this sound familiar? With bitumen she sealed my lid. Oh my goodness, it gets better. And she cast me into the river, which rose up over me, and the river bore me up and carried me to Aki, the drawer of water. Oh my goodness, right? The drawer of water, it's even better, right? The drawer of water. And Aki, the drawer of water, took me as his son, and he reared me. And Aki, the drawer of water, appointed me as his gardener. Now, she appointed him as her own son. He appointed him as his gardener. And while I was a gardener, Ishtar granted me her love. And for 4 years, I exercised kingship. But then, unfortunately, the story breaks off. It says, she granted me her love, and sounds like he has a liaison with Ishtar. And then who knows? And so Ishtar does something, and then ... the text is broken, and then in years I exercised kingship comes off. So somehow he's become king. These stories are common. They're all over the ancient Near East. This is the one that is most like the Exodus story, but they're common. And they must have historical kernels to them. And the historical kernel is a pauper became a king. But then he has to justify his position. So, you thought I was a commoner? No. See, I was actually the son of this high priestess of high royal blood, but I was torn from my family and floated down the river, and then I was found and raised by this other person. But my divine nature just won out, and people couldn't keep me down, and I became king.
There's even a story like that in the Mahabharata.
It's all over the place. This is a common story because you've got to somehow justify, because paupers sometimes became kings, and then they had to justify how it happened, right? And you get the other justification here is this Ishtar thing. Ishtar came to me, and we had this liaison, and so she chose me as her lover, and so clearly I was meant to be king. Goddesses loved me and chose me, and I was of high birth to begin with. And you see the point? Moses is doing the same thing. This is a trope, a literary trope. And a good example of a literary trope is a lawman walks into the saloon, and they always have swinging saloon doors, and they swing closed, and you look around, and the camera pans around, and there you see the criminals up against the bar. And then high noon strikes, and they walk out into the road, and everyone boards up their windows and goes and hides, and you know what's coming next. They're going to have a shootout at the OK Corral or something, right? The shootout is coming. Those are literary tropes, and when you reference them, you know what's coming next. So when we have Moses following the literary trope of Sargon the Great, we know what's coming next, right? Although we should point out that in this case, the trope is stood on its head. Normally, it's a person of high birth who's raised by lowly parents and then becomes highborn again. In this case, it's the other way around. A person of lowly birth, a slave, an Israelite, is raised by an Egyptian princess, but later finds out who he really is and goes back to the Israelites. It's inside out and backwards. And so I think that is possibly significant, and it's also another one of those interesting hints for our historicity point, which we'll probably come back to. All right, let's see where we're at. Moses flees to Midian. So, one day, Moses had grown up, and he went out of the people and saw their forced labor. So here's a person who's grown up, a pampered person, but he knows who he is now. He's grown up, and he goes outside, and he sees what his life might have been like as a slave if he hadn't been taken in by Pharaoh, Pharaoh's daughter. And presumably, he has this sort of change of heart moment. And he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his folk. And so what does he do? He looks around to see if anyone's watching, and he kills the Egyptian. And he hides him in the sand. Moses is going off half-cocked to save the Israelites on his own. Later, he'll come back with God's help and succeed. But here he's trying to do it on his own, and all he ends up doing is getting himself in trouble, because the next day, some Israelites are talking, and he says, "You shouldn't fight. Our enemy is the Egyptians." And they say, "Are you going to kill us like you killed that Egyptian?" Word's getting around. Presumably, he left the Israelite he just saved alive, and that guy's talking. Right? And so word is getting around, and he's worried, Moses is worried, rightly so, that he's going to be in trouble. In fact, it says, verse 15, Pharaoh heard of it, and he sought to kill Moses. So Moses flees. And where does he go? Moses goes to a place called Midian, where he will meet some women at a well. Speaking of literary tropes, let's get to that for just a minute. So he fled to the land of Midian. That's very important, and we'll come back to the importance of Midian again and again and again in this story. And he sat down by a well, and the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water. And they filled the troughs to water their father's flock, but some shepherds came and drove them away. So Moses got up and came to their defense and watered their flock for them. Do you remember all those stories about, she watered all of his, in the Isaac, Jacob stories, these people watered the flocks? And the one guy brought water for him and for all his camels, the one lady, and so she becomes this is a trope that we saw in Isaac's story, in Jacob's story. Now Moses is doing it, and even Jesus meets a woman at a well, and usually you end up marrying the woman at the well, but there's always this drawing out of water story, and in Jesus' version, he talks about being the water of life and drawing out water for the woman, etc. So this is again another of our literary tropes. When you see this story, you know what's coming next, right? And by putting Moses in this situation, the author has cast him in the context of the patriarchs of old. Moses is another of the great patriarchs of old who's met this woman at the well. So they return to their father, and his name is Ruel. This is an important key to our authorship question. Moses' father-in-law is named either Ruel or Jethro, and I believe there's a third name that I can't think of right now. But depending on the source, his name is different. They will give him different names. Now, when we did the Genesis story, we noticed that God had different names. Right? That's how we noticed that there was a difference between J and P, because P would call God El, and J would call God Jehovah or Yahweh. In this case, now we see another of our hints for the author stories. One will call him Ruel, and the other will call him Jethro. Let's see. And he said, "How is it that you have come back so soon today?" And they said, "Well, an Egyptian helped us against the shepherds, and he drew the water for us, and he watered the flock." And he, Ruel, said to his daughters, "Where is this dude? Why did you leave the man? Invite him to break bread. Bring him in. Let's feed him," right? And Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gives Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. And she bore a son, and he named him Gershom, for he said, "For I have been an alien residing in a foreign land." This is also important because we believe that the word Levi, now this is not the folk etymology given in Genesis. In Genesis, a folk etymology is given for the name Levi, but we believe the name Levi actually means a stranger in a foreign land. Moses is a Levite. I told you this Exodus story, all the main characters are Levites, or Midianites. Moses is a Levite, and here now he's a stranger in the land. That may actually be a real reference to the meaning of being a Levite. And says 23, after a long time the king of Egypt died. So, starting in 23 to the end, we actually switch authors. I should point out we're now in P. This is a P source. And this is P's reason for the Exodus. So in the next few verses, we will hear why P thinks the Exodus happened. He says, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. And out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. That last phrase, God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them, is very cumbersome in Egypt. In Hebrew, it's really nice. God looked, God saw. And therefore he knows what's happening. Notice he doesn't say, the suffering is in there, but he doesn't say he's saving them because of the suffering. It says he knew the suffering, but he's going to save them because of his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. This is the same thing we said when we talked about Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. The question was not, does Abraham believe in God? The question was, does Abraham trust God to keep his promises? And so that theme is very important to P. God makes promises, and God keeps them. And the entire Exodus, all the miracles, everything God does is because he made a promise to Abraham, and he's going to keep that promise, gosh darn it. And so the entire justification for Exodus, according to P, is to keep the promise he made to Abraham. So, chapter 3, verse 1. Moses, and now, by the way, we're back to a different author. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro. Different author, right? Okay, so Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. You would think, by the way, that an Israelite would not make up a story about Moses having a father-in-law who was a pagan priest. And so that's kind of a weird hint, again, of historicity that we'll come back to. Jethro, priest of Midian, and he led his flock beyond the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Again, the name for Horeb is different in these different sources. Sometimes it's Horeb, sometimes it's Sinai, depends on which source we're in. So where is Mount Sinai? Where is Mount Horeb? This is the traditional place. It's in southern Sinai. It was picked by Constantine's mother, who went on a pilgrimage to find all these sacred sites, and she kind of picked it and said, this is where it happened. I don't think she knows what she's talking about. Although it's a great tourist trap if you ever go there. You can actually hike up Mount Sinai and watch the sunrise. It's kind of fun. But it's not Mount Sinai, we're pretty sure. Mount Sinai is almost certainly, because he's keeping the flocks of his father-in-law, Jethro, a Midianite, high priest. It's got to be up in Midian. So this is, again, the second point I'm going to make. Mount Sinai is in Midian. And Mount Sinai is the point of the entire story. It's where the Israelites encounter God. This is, again, incredibly important for what's really happening here. The Israelites are going to encounter God in a place that is a mountain in Midian, where Moses is watering his father's flocks. Now, Midian is in the Sinai Peninsula, but it's further north and I believe east. There an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire. That term angel of the Lord is fascinating because it usually just means the presence of the Lord in this text. The angel of the Lord and the Lord himself are almost indistinguishable. Thousands of books and gallons of ink have been spilled trying to figure out who the angel of the Lord is and how that's different from the Lord. But what's fascinating about it is after he meets the angel of the Lord, from then on he speaks as if he is the Lord. So it's the presence, the messenger, something, who knows? I don't even know, and so I'm not going to try to tell you because I don't have a clue.
Well, wouldn't a good candidate, now I know this is for a different type of audience, but wouldn't a good candidate for that sort of thing be Michael? Because the name Michael or Mikael means like the Lord.
Who is like God, or one who is like God, or who, question, is like God? Answer, probably nobody. Michael is an archangel, but it's not clear that the concept of the archangels has been developed at this time in Israel's history. The archangels come from their connection to Persian religion. And so this is an earlier tradition than that by far. And so people have hypothesized archangels, people have hypothesized Christ. Christians have done so. But whoever this is a representation of God, and he speaks for God in this text. Or it is God itself. So maybe in this case, messenger just means God coming down to speak to people, right? Something because angel just means messenger. So we have a messenger from Yahweh, or Yahweh himself sending a message. Maybe, I don't know. So I'm not going to try to tell you the answer to this. So the angel comes down and appears in a flame of fire in a bush. Somehow, burning bushes and fire itself is a symbol of the presence of God. God's presence is represented by burning flame. probably related to the sacrifice and the incense altar. That's why in ritual they connected God's presence to flame and smoke. And so here we have a flame and a smoke of this burning bush, but it's not consumed. So Moses says, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. So there's a miracle. It starts with a miracle. And when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to Moses out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here am I. And he said, come no closer, remove the sandals from off your feet. The place whereon you are standing is holy ground. This is a temple reference. This place is a temple. And so when we get to the temple, I will make an explicit connection between Mount Sinai and the temple. The temple they build in the wilderness, which takes up about half of the book of of Exodus, describing this temple, its floor plan intentionally mirrors the Mount Sinai. In fact, the candlestick they put in there mirrors the burning bush. And so he's telling him, you're at a natural temple. A mountain is a natural temple. Take off your shoes. And he said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look. And God said, I've seen their suffering and their cry, and so I've come down to save them. And so, because of all this, unto Pharaoh I'm going to send you. And this begins, and we don't have time, so we'll start with this next time. But this begins Moses' complaints. Who am I? Why are you sending me? Right? Who am I to go save these people? I can't do this. And so we have Moses complaining at God. You've chosen the wrong person. And God, of course, will get ticked off and say, I know who. So we'll get to Moses' 3 complaints later. But in the middle of those complaints, he says, if I go to, in verse 13, if I go to them and say, the God of your ancestors sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Who shall I say? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. This I am that I am reference is a reference to the name Yahweh, because Yahweh looks and sounds a lot like the to be verb. So the author here is making a connection between Yahweh and the to be verb. I'm the one who is. And he said further, thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent you to me. And God also said to Moses, thus shall you say to the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. Which author are we in? So if you remember my discussion about authorship, I said you can tell you're in J because he will say Yahweh everywhere. And you can tell you're in E because he will say Elohim everywhere, or P. Well, that's true in Genesis. We're in E. And this is the explanation of where this whole name thing was coming from. The documentary hypothesis is often explained as people having different names for God. That's not the issue. The issue is, when is God's name known? In all 4 sources, God's name is Yahweh. In E, no one knows that until this moment. So in E and P, God is called Elohim until now. And from this moment on, E will use both names, and so will P for God. And so in these narratives, there is a memory in both E and P, both written by Levites, I might add, that God's name was discovered on Mount Sinai in a place called Midian. And people called him El before that. And it just so happens there's a god in Canaan called El. And Abraham was hanging out in Canaan. And he called God El. And then suddenly God's name shifts to Yahweh. After Moses goes to Midian, the name of God changes. I believe there's a historical kernel here because it explains this. And remember, Jay doesn't care about this, and he just calls him Yahweh all along. But he's someone from the court of the kings in Judah. That's who Jay, we think, lived in the court of the kings in Judah. E and P are Levites. And they remember, again, the story is all about Levites. And the Levite sources remember this story of how God was known as El until this moment. And then somehow in Midian, his name changed. And they realized his name was Yahweh. This is the Egyptian text of the earliest reference to Yahweh that we have so far found. It is from the reign of Amenhotep III. There's actually two of them that say the same thing. One from Amenhotep III, 14th century BCE. The other from Ramses II, the 13th century BCE. Notice both of those dates are before the Exodus, at least where most people date the Exodus. Long before the Exodus, there's a reference to Yahweh, the first reference to Yahweh. And it's not in a Hebrew source. It's not in a Semitic source. It's not in any of these tribes from Israel and Levant. It's from Egypt. And it says, the land of the Shasu of Yahweh, and it says that place is over by Edom and Midian. There's a group of people worshiping Yahweh in Midian before the Exodus takes place. And Moses leaves Egypt, wanders to Midian, marries the high priest of Midian's daughter, and suddenly discovers that the God he's worshipped all along, El, is actually named Yahweh. Now that is too big a coincidence for my brain to wrap its head around, right? So, again, when we talk about historicity, there's a hint here of something that really happened. That God's name changed from El to Yahweh through an encounter with people living in Midian who already worshipped Yahweh. This is the E text. I'm going to tell you one more thing about E and then we're done. This is the genealogy of Abraham, and it's big and forget all the details, but you'll notice that Abraham has 3 wives. Hagar, Sarah, and this other person named Keturah. There's only one of our authors who tells us about Keturah. Guess who it is? E. And guess whose children Keturah has? There's a long list, and right in the middle is one named Midian. E cares a lot that we understand that the Midianites are also descendants of Abraham. And they worship a God named Yahweh. And Moses marries a Midianite, and he is the son-in-law of a Midianite high priest who worships, we assume, Yahweh or Yahweh. Now, the name, there's a whole debate about how the name is pronounced. I did the Yahweh because that actually matches really well with this Egyptian rendering of the name. But there's some debate on how you pronounce it, and there's more than one way to pronounce the Egyptian, too. We actually don't know how the name is pronounced. The scholarly consensus is Yahweh, emphasis on the last syllable. There's some Coptic and Egyptian sources that make me think Yahweh, but I don't know that for sure. But in any event, this is a real attested God, and I think there's some real history going on here, and we will tell the story of the burning bush and Moses' call and the plagues next time.
Yes.
And I will see you then, and we will drown some Egyptians in the Red Sea, and it'll be lots of good fun. Thank you all for coming.